The Activated Man is an award-winning supernatural thriller starring the late Tony Todd in his final lead role. The film follows Ors Gabriel, who, after losing his beloved dog Louie to cancer, begins seeing terrifying visions of a menacing entity known as the Fedora Man. Has Ors' mind fractured, or is this all actually real? The Activated Man also features an ensemble supporting cast, including horror icon Kane Hodder, Sean Young of Blade Runner, Andrew Keegan of 10 Things I Hate About You, Sab Shimono of The Shadow, and Vladimir Kulich of The 13th Warrior. The Activated Man opens in select theaters on December 13th. It also comes to digital and on demand the same day. Learn more and follow the film at The Activated Man Movie on Facebook and Instagram.
And welcome back to Scarred for Life, the podcast where we open up old wounds by looking back at the films that scared us as kids. I'm Terry.
And I'm Mary Beth.
And each episode, our special guest brings with them a movie that traumatized them as a child.
This week, our guest is Stephen C. Miller. He is the director and writer of films such as Silent Night, the reboot from 2012, Margot, and most recently Werewolves, which is coming to theaters on December 6th. Welcome to the show, Stephen!
Yeah, awesome. So happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
We're really excited to chat with you. So for our listeners who might not be familiar with it, can you sort of give a good synopsis of what Werewolves is about?
So Werewolves is crazy, right? Werewolves is basically...
Sorry.
Let's just go there
It's a good way to describe it.
It's
a good
just
way
wild.
to start.
A lot of people have compared it as The Purge meets Werewolves, which is a good comparison because it's basically the idea is we're dropping you into the second year that this phenomenon has happened, which is a supermoon has come out and turned everyone that has stepped into the moonlight into werewolves. Everybody. There is no one gets away from it unless they're out of the moonlight. And it happened the year before. And so basically you're being dropped into the second year that this supermoon's about to rise. And the whole world is basically bracing for the idea that this is going to happen again. You have groups of people that want to turn because it's like a drug. They want to go again, right? You have groups of people that are trying desperately not to turn because they've never turned. And then you have the government who's trying to test to try to find the cure for why this gene is turning people. So it's really a lot of stuff packed into a wild and crazy night of werewolves. And I think for me, that's what I loved about it.
I was going to ask, what drew you to it besides, the entire premise being, kind of insane, but, the perfect kind of insane, you know what I mean? It's so crazy. You're like, of course I have to do this. This is a perfect horror movie premise.
It was a no-brainer. When they pitched it to me and then I read it and I was like, oh my God, the idea that everyone turns and look, I'm a big slow burn werewolf fan. I like that. I like the one werewolf or this or they're battling. And that's usually what we get. But with this, it was like, oh, fuck, we're just going to go balls to the wall from the beginning, and it's just going to be werewolves everywhere. How do I do that? Sure, I want to do it, and try to figure it out, right? And so I think a lot of it was a challenge. A lot of it was I haven't seen this many werewolves on screen ever.
That's what I was going to say. That's like you said, it's usually the solo wolfman to have packs of werewolves. That's...
Especially for a budget like this, for this kind of movie. We're not a big guy, right? We're not Universal with Wolfman, right? We're an indie film. We're talking under $8 million. This is not a big movie, right? And so this is a really cool little indie film that got lucky with getting some really great creature effect artists on board in the name of Alec Gillis. And, the guy did Pumpkinhead, for Christ's sake. So, the guy knows what he's doing, That's
got to be such an honor to work with someone like that on your movie. Even though, I don't know, that's just so cool to have, horror royalty to make your monsters. That's just awesome. That's, a dream come true for a
absolute
director,
blast.
I feel
and total, sweetheart on set. He's just amazing. He loves, and the crazy thing is he had never done werewolves, so this was obviously something where he's like, God, I've been here for how long in this business and never done werewolves? We got to do werewolves.
Oh my God.
So he had fun with me creating them and designing them and really coming up with something that was menacing and back to sort of a real creature wolf and not, a wolf like a real wolf running around or like a sparkly wolf or whatever. This is a werewolf, humanoid. And I think that they really really turned it up on this one. I think they did a great job creating them.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, I love the look of these werewolves, particularly because it brings me back to the 80s with like the Howling, or like when werewolves were a little bit more than just a big wolf type of thing. So I'm loving that we're going back to that.
Yeah, that's definitely it, man. I mean, I'm an 80s kid, so like the Howling, American Werewolf in London, I mean, those were movies that were top notch. I mean, even Silver Bullet for me was a big deal.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, when that whole church erupted and all of the people in the church were wolfing out, I was like, oh my God. So there's a big ode to that sequence in the movie. So like there's a lot of like really fun sequences that I sort of picked at, like, okay, I like this from Dog Soldiers or this from Ginger Snaps. So there's some fun stuff in there that I sort of was like, okay, how can I sort of pay a little homage to a lot of the movies that I loved in this genre? And I think you guys will pick up on that pretty quick. I do that with a lot of my movies, and this one's no different.
Yeah. Well, and like, you obviously have the werewolves, but then you have a really great cast with Frank Grillo leading, and I feel like I see his name everywhere, like in genre right now, and I wanted to hear about working with him in the film, just because he's everywhere. I feel like
he's everywhere. Like, Frank, you got to slow down, dude. You're like making a ton of shit, right? And like he is, but he's just a powerhouse, and I love Frank because he's so passionate and he really wants to get on set. He wants to do it right. I mean, it's a werewolf movie. It's really difficult coming into that for an actor, not knowing how it's going to come across, especially the wolf being practical effects. And am I going to be in like a cheesy sci-fi channel? What am I going to get into here? Right? Is this going to be a really bad B movie? So credit to Frank for like believing everything I said and telling him, hey, this is going to be cool. I'm going to make it cool. It's going to be kick-ass. We're going to go, extreme. We're going to have fun. And he bought into it really early on, showed up. I mean, this is Frank's movie. He's there every day. He's got to battle these things every day. And we're in Puerto Rico in the heat, and he's, battling werewolves at 2 a.m. Like, it can get crazy. And Frank, to his credit, was awesome and loved every minute of it. Super gracious with the rest of the crew, like Katrina Law and Ilfinish Hardish and and Lou Diamond Phillips. He just super gracious to everybody. And he totally owns it. And I'm sitting with him and watched it for the first time. He was just hitting me the whole movie, just punching me. He was just like, how did you do this? How did you get these things to do that? And as people will see is when there's a wolf on screen, we didn't touch that wolf like in post. That wolf is how I shot it on screen from day one. So there's no touching him. There's no cleaning them up. Like, that is how we shot them. Of course, there are some CG things moving around with some of the ones that are running or things like that, which is like impossible. Mm-hmm. But even though we do have practical ones running, that's them. That's them on screen. I don't touch them. And so that was something amazing. I really promised also to Alec was like, look, we're going to shoot them how you made them. And if there's little imperfections here and there, then we're going to live with it. And so that's what we did.
I was going to ask about that because I know like there's so much practical in this, but sometimes like it comes in. But that's so lovely to hear that you're just like, no, we want the imperfections to show through, because again, that's like part of the charm of I think of like practical effects is like, yeah, they don't look perfect, but you don't want them to look perfect. Well,
and the cool thing about that is that's how I even approached with the visual effects artists, is that I said, look at the imperfections and the practical, and everything on the visual effects side was basically molded after the practical. So any of the imperfections they had come across in the VFX. So it's not like we did a VFX version first and then tried to make a practical version off of that. I really had them concentrate on making it feel like the practical version of the wolf, if there was that guy in the shot. And so, we really found a really good mix, but I thought it was really fun to be able to show what we've shot in its full form and not be able to touch it. It just says a lot about the lighting. It says a lot about Alec's creatures. It says a lot about, the DP, Brandon Cox, and shooting it. It's just, all these people that did such a great job.
Well, and that's got to be awesome, too, for the actors to also get to interact with a practical wolf. Like, I always hear that. It's just easier when it's in front of you rather than having to pretend that it's in front of you.
Totally. And Frank's used to being on a green screen. I mean, he did, Captain America. So, like, he knows, he's been there. He understands what that world is. And for him, he would explicitly tell me, like, this is so much more fun. Like, I can touch them. I can high five them. We can party with them, that's Frank's thing. Like, how do we party with the wolves, and we were having such a blast with that. And And that was something like my daughter is like a teen wolf in the movie. Like she's changing in the movie. And like, so she gets to face off against Frank Grillo. So even that for her was like
that's cool.
Monumental. Like she's 14. So it was like, oh my God, Frank Grillo, but we get to battle each. So, there's something about having these things on set, and even Frank coming and seeing my daughter like that after sitting in the makeup chair for hours. And he was just like, oh my God, she's fucking scary, dude. And so like, so it is cool. It's cool to have them there.
Oh, it's amazing.
That's awesome. I mean, and you have like a pretty extensive filmography, but like I feel like, is this the first time you've worked with such extensive practical effects in your filmography? Can you?
Yeah, I mean, besides before it was like my first film was a zombie film, and it was a lot of practical effects, but it was on such a smaller scale. It was not like this. I did another movie called Under the Bed that was a creature, but again, that was one bodysuit that didn't have any animatronics. It was again like really small indie movie. No, this one is the first one where I'm dealing with massive creatures, massive effects, massive puppetry happening all the time, right? I mean, we had 20 guys running puppeteer works. You got to remember, we had 7 suits made. So we had 7 suits and had to make these 7 guys look like hundreds of guys. And so, I'm literally moving the camera with these 7 and pushing them over here for this shot. And then, so they're doing a lot of work with like all of the different puppeteers having to control all of their eyes, movements, mouths, teeth, tongue, saliva. Like, it was just a bunch of stuff. So it was definitely an undertaking at its biggest for me. But obviously that made it even more fun because, you're just sitting there like a kid in a candy shop, like, oh my God, can you wink his eye? Can you give me a smile? Yeah. What can these things do?
Can you just give me like one little string of drool real quick?
Yeah. Oh, I did that all the time. I was like, can it just come out the right side of his tooth? And they're like, oh my God, Steven. Like, I mean, I was trying to give these things as much personality as possible. And I think that's what's fun that you'll see in the movie is the main sort of wolves all have individual personalities, and they really shine. And I think that is a credit to, again, Alec, but the performers in the suits who really give you those performances, and really kind of take it to the next level.
And that's got to be so cool as a director to have, like, with your filmography, to keep doing new things that you haven't gotten to try before. I feel like that's got to be so also, like, just like creatively fulfilling for you as a filmmaker to be like, I have this thing I've done now, like a new skill that I know how to direct puppets and puppeteers. Like, it's just it's got to be so cool. Yeah,
you can only blow so much stuff up, before it's like, I've blown that up like 10 times in 5 different movies, and that's where it was going. And in the late 2010s, where I felt like I was doing action here after action here. And so I was like, oh my God, I can only, fight this guy so many different ways. So yeah, so to get something that was brooding and bloody and dark and fun and scary and all of these things, which was a lot of fun.
Hell yeah. Fuck yeah.
Because I was going to say, I'm looking at the room behind you, and there's a lot of horror memorabilia stuff, like posters, and I love your Jaws. Is that a blanket? The Jaws blanket?
Jaws blankets back there, the Texas chain, even the Fright Night poster is like right there.
Yep.
I know, I see that. That was I went straight to that. But you said you grew up in the 80s, and I got to think, I'm just thinking this must be like kind of in some ways a dream come true if you grew up watching the practical effects of the 80s, because I think a lot of filmmakers today, they're coming up and all of a sudden everything is CG, and here you are being able to kind of do the ethos of the 1980s big creature feature type stuff. I just got to think that was fun.
Oh man, it was a dream come true for sure. I mean, I've wanted to make a werewolf movie since I got out here, and my entire team could tell you that I've had werewolf scripts sitting with me for a long time, and then it just never got made, and then this one came. But like, the idea of being able to make practical is always something that resonates with me, because my kids have grown up, even like I just use my kids as an analysis because I just see how much they see is all CG, all animated, all already curated for them. And so when they saw the practical wolves, they almost lost their mind. They didn't even know how to process that they were right there. And I think for them, it actually made it so much scarier because they weren't used to seeing it. Like in the 80s, we grew up with it so heavily that it was just like a thing. We got it. You know what I mean? It was almost like we took it for granted. You know what I mean? And so now these kids growing up are not used to this, and I think bringing this back in a sense is almost new. And I think that's what drove me to do it, was just to be something completely different than everybody else is trying to do, and try to just see if that works. That was the idea.
What I was gonna say, I feel like we're getting into a new, again, it's not new, but it is a new era of practical effects and of people realizing, oh, it's actually not that much cheaper or whatever to do visual effects. It's actually cooler to do, especially in horror specifically, and just seeing so many more, distribution companies, production companies taking chances on movies with practical is just like very heartwarming to see. I wish they'd be a bigger budgets with practical, there's always something, but it is nice to see films like this as like your film that isn't a huge film, but I guess on the indie side, it's relative. I don't know, however we want to scale it, whatever. It's still cool to be able to do
horror
that.
Side, it's definitely bigger than like your Terrifier $500,000 movie, right? Like, or whatever that is, right? Like it's definitely bigger than that. It's just when it comes to monster movies like this, they just don't make them anymore at this budget level, right? Like, so it's either they're $80 million movies or they don't make them. So it's like,
it's so weird. So it's cool that like you can make a movie like this and you're like, hey, you can do it without having to have like tens of millions of dollars.
I think that's sort of like my big push and goal really is like, look, I sort of miss that mid-budget range movies where like Dark Castle would do in the 90s or like where it was like that $20 to $30 million movie. It had some cool leads that were up and coming. The monster was cool. The horror was cool. And, and the studio all got to make money because it wasn't costing an arm and a leg, right? And I think that is sort of like my big push with this movie is like, look, guys, if we can do it for this, like there's a world where we can bring that mid-budget movie back and give an audience something that feels big and spectacular, with the cinematic spectacle, but it's not costing you an arm and a leg. And I think that's something that's sort of like, hey, maybe this is that calling card. We'll see. But, that was our intent with the movie.
That's awesome. I love that. But we've talked about, we've mentioned a little bit about, like, you grew up in the 80s watching these movies, but how did you get introduced to the horror genre? Was that something you've always been into as a kid? Like, what was the entry point for you?
I got into it as a kid simply because my friends, like, my parents weren't showing me that. It was my friends in their basement, and, like, in, I don't know, maybe, like, 8 or 9 and like showing me Evil Dead in the basement, you know what I mean? And I'm like, what is this? This is wild, and like, so, my parents sort of raised me on like the ETs of the world, Back to the Future, Amblin. And so when they would show me, I remember one film specifically was like, you got to check this movie. It was Evil Dead. And we watched it and I just lost my shit. I was like, this movie's bananas. Like, whatever's happening in this movie, I want to figure out, how do I do that? Like, how do I do this whole thing, right? And then obviously, as you get older, you're watching movies like Alien and stuff like that really sort of ratchet up the tension with the creature and make it more, it's big and cool and cinematic. And so, it really started pretty early with me, and it was always my friends sort of pushing me. I think the only time my dad and I ever watched a horror movie was The Exorcist, and I was probably like 12. And I remember, I don't remember watching The Exorcist. I remember watching my dad's reactions to The Exorcist. And I remember
his first time watching it with you?
I don't know. All I know is he was like cowering like a little baby. Like he was like under the sheet like this. And my dad's like the wife beater guy, like, burly. He's just sitting back. Nothing bothers my dad. So to see him, like he had the sheet like pulled up halfway, I was like, oh man. Like, how do I do that? Like, how do I do that to someone? Like, and I think that's really where that sort of birth of like filmmaking really happened, was like, if my dad can be scared and that whatever this movie is invoked that reaction, oh man, how can I do that? Like, that's what I want to do.
I love that, because I feel like so often we hear stories about like a person being scared, not their parent. So hearing that you got to watch your parent experience fear is like so cool. Because also as a kid, I feel like you're not used to seeing your parents be scared.
No.
So it's such a weird experience seeing a scared parent, and it's scary.
That's why I said I just was watching him going, what is he doing? He just can't handle it. Like, hey, I think when she turned her head around, he just got up and started pacing, and so I just was like, I think he was probably also thinking, what am I showing my kid right now at the same time? He had to be thinking that at the same time, so there's a lot of those emotions that are really funny when I think about it. But that has to be when it really sparked.
That's amazing. That's so cool.
So what kind of horror movies did you sort of gravitate to as a kid? Was it the big creature kind of films, or what were you watching?
Yeah, I was always watching more of the action horror. Like I feel like
Okay.
I was it was creature stuff, but like I definitely gravitated to stuff that was a little bit more kinetic or felt a little bit more like, Aliens was something when I was growing up was like, oh man, military fighting aliens, like that's sick. Like so, that was sort of like where I was at. And at the time I even felt like Terminator was like, was its own side of a horror movie.
Oh, absolutely. It's a slasher.
Yeah, those were the kind of movies that I was gravitating to. Then again, like I was also just gravitated to stuff like Peter Jackson's Dead Alive that were just zany. And I think that's because I liked the idea of fusing some kind of humor or ridiculousness with the horror because it settled better for me. I wasn't trying to be grossed out. I was just trying to have fun watching the movie. And so even though Dead Alive is gross, there's a certain sense of fun to that movie that
Oh my
there
God,
sure
yeah.
is.
I kick ass for the Lord. I mean, come on.
Yeah, there's just so many great lines. I mean, I think it was even the box art that was so amazing when you went into a Blockbuster. That box art was like killer. King box art, right? And so
good.
that's something we focused on too when we were dealing with Werewolves. It's like, how do we put something on a poster that the audience goes, okay, I got to go see that. But yeah, it was zany horror. It was action horror. Those were sort of the things that I was really gravitating to sort of, I guess, refine my taste of what I liked. And I think that really came out in Silent Night, in my reboot of Silent Night, Deadly Night, because, I wasn't really trying to be like hardcore as much as I was trying to just give the movie a little flavor that I thought the first original didn't have. Because I didn't want to make I didn't want to make the original movie. I didn't even want to try to remake that movie in all reality. All I wanted to do was make a killer Santa Claus movie, and they just happened to have the rights for Silent Night, Deadly Night.
Isn't that great? You're like, okay, cool,
That's
it's the Silent Night reboot.
Yeah, it's cool. And everybody's like, well, you put a mask on. I was like, yeah, I mean, I was just trying to give the movie flavor that the first one didn't have, but also, obviously pay some homage to it, like in, of course, like Garbage Day lines and stuff like that, like in there. But like, I feel like that's sort of me, though. I like to cherry pick from movies I love. I've never been ashamed of that. And I feel like I like to, like, even when I'm talking about shots with my DP, I'm always talking in cinema form. Oh man, remember that shot from Seven? Let's do that shot. You know what I mean? Like, so that's sort of my language.
I directed my first movie and I was like, I want this shot to be like The Strangers. And they were like, got it. So like, I get you about being like, no, I'm just going to straight up say like what I want this shot to look like from a movie. Because again, like, it's the point of reference and sometimes it just is what it is. And
it
it's
is
like
what it is. And there's always a way for you to manipulate it and make it your own, which I find the fun way to do. And everyone always gets it when you say certain things. Oh, I get it. I know what you're talking about. I understand exactly what you're saying. And when you're on a set with 100 people and they're all trying to get to one place and get a goal across, it's much easier to talk film terms to film people for them to all go, right, we understand what Steven's saying, moving on, right? And that's the same thing with Frank. When me and Frank talked, it was very much like we talked about other movies more than we really talked about Werewolves because I was just trying to get Frank to be comfortable with me, right? And understand that I knew what I was talking about, and I wasn't trying to give him my grand vision for the movie. I was just trying to hang out with Frank and let him know, hey, I'm cool from that standpoint, and that he's going to be cool with, he's safe. We're going to make a cool movie.
Yeah. Like, this material, you love, like, he's in good hands.
He's in good hands. That was my main goal from the beginning, is to make sure they all understood that.
Yeah. Before we go to your pick, I'm sorry, Terry, I totally just cut you off.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask, do you get scared watching movies as an adult?
Yeah, still. Yeah, I still do. It's like, The Strangers is a good point, because The Strangers, when that movie came out, I was terrified. That movie freaked me the fuck out. Like, I don't know why.
It's scary. It still scares me. I've seen it a million times and it still scares me.
Yeah. The movie is scary. That's all there is to it. It's scary. And it is a little bit more difficult now, when you make movies to be completely engulfed. But I kind of find it easier for me now that I have kids because I'm watching it with them. And so I'm almost feeling their energy. And if I can feel they're sort of scared, I'm sort of also sort of getting a little bit anxious. Like, oh man, are they going to get scared? It's a little bit of a different kind of scared vibe. So that it's kind of surreal when you start watching those with them, and they're just like, oh my God, Dad, we watched Jaws for the first time last summer, and you would think that they wouldn't be into it. It's so slow. But oh my God, they were like glued to the screen. Like, they couldn't take their eyes off. They were glued. My daughter at the end of it was like, Dad, I can't go back in the ocean ever again. She was having like she was just like, I can't believe you made me watch that, but she loved it.
That makes my heart so
cool.
happy that that's still happening
Mine
to children.
too.
I mean, I'm sad, but also like I had that experience.
Yeah.
So I'm like, I'm glad that
too.
that's like it's not generational. Like, it is an evergreen. We will all be terrified of the ocean from this movie, and that's just such a testament.
They're 10. They're like 10. My son's 10, and my daughter's was 12 at the time. So it's like, it's not like they're older kids. They're younger still, and watching these movies and having fun with them. When we showed them Gremlins for the first time, they lost their mind. They were like, "This is the greatest movie we've ever seen in our life." And me and my wife were going, "Do you remember it being this fucking crazy? Like, do you remember that they throw Gremlins in the microwave, or Santa gets fucking stuck in the chimney and he's dead? Like, do you remember all of these things?" And we're just looking at each other. My kids are just like, they're like having a blast, So I don't know if that's a testament to my kids being insane or what, but like they love when they get a chance to watch something with us, like that they think they're not allowed to.
That's so nice.
Yeah, it's fun
amazing.
to do.
That's cool to get to experience it with them and like get to watch things with them for the first time. And it's like, you've already seen it, but you get to experience. I get that is so nice to like pass that down to your kids too.
Yeah, it's a fun thing. And some of them are stuff I haven't seen in a while. And so it's cool to just revisit and have fun with it again. Yeah, so it's fun.
So what's the scariest movie you've seen recently that wasn't a rewatch with your kids though?
Oh man, that's a good question. Probably Longlegs. Longlegs
Hell
fucking freaked me out.
Fuck yeah.
Longlegs freaked me out. I was watching it like with my headphones on at night, and usually how I watch my movies is that in my theater, like my headphones on in my living room because my kids are asleep, and so it's even worse because it's just like all in there. But yeah, that movie freaked me out. I loved it.
The sound design in headphones must be so good. I've only watched it. I haven't watched it with headphones, but I feel like the sound design in that movie in headphones especially must be like even more unnerving.
Watched it in my son's VR too, just because I thought maybe that would be even crazier, but I was like, I'll just stick to the TV and headphones.
That's too immersive.
I won't get too wild with this one, But
I don't want to get that sucked into that one.
I think that's definitely the one. That one was great. Yeah, it was great.
Yeah, that was a movie I saw. And I had to go back to a hotel room, and I, for a split second, was a little bit nervous to go into a dark hotel room, which has not happened in a long time. So I appreciate a movie that gets me a little bit scared of the dark, like I was when I was a kid.
Yeah.
All right. But, Stephen, we've talked about werewolves. It's time to talk about another creature. What movie did you bring with you today for us to talk about?
I thought we should talk about Fright Night.
Hell yeah. So, y'all, if you have not seen the original Fright Night, one, please go watch it immediately. But if you haven't, here is the synopsis. In Fright Night, a teenager believes that the newcomer in his neighborhood is a vampire. So he turns to an actor in a television-hosted horror movie for help to deal with the undead.
Which is exactly what I would have done too. But
yeah, of course, we all would have called someone we know like that does TV that does this to fight a werewolf.
Absolutely. All right, but take us back. Yeah, take us back though. How old were you when you saw this? How did you see this? Kind of give us your horror story of your first watch of Fright Night.
Oh man, so this is another one where I was at a different friend's house, and we were doing a Saturday night sleepover, and I was probably like 8. So this is like 98 or 89, 88 or 89 or something like that. And he was like, "Hey, we're going to put on a vampire movie." And to be honest, the only one I had seen up to that point was probably Lost Boys, and Lost Boys was like, its own kind of wild vampire thing. But like, Fright Night, when it first came on, when I first started watching it, I was immediately engulfed because of the TV side of it, because it had that Peter Vincent character, and he was sort of watching these old movies, because that's what I sort of did. I would turn on late night TV, and there'd be these old monster movies on, Creature from the Black Lagoon, or like something really, really campy was on, and so I kind of resonated with that immediately. And so it was something that, as the movie progressed, and the idea that the next door neighbor was the vampire was even more crazy because I had a next door neighbor that I thought was weird. So like I kept thinking like, oh my God, like this is very parallel to my next door neighbor. This guy, I don't know, maybe I could be living next door to a vampire. And I think that's what's brilliant about this movie is that it puts the vampire in the neighborhood. And I don't know that we've seen that up until this point. And like that to me, at least at that age, was terrifying because that meant he was next door. He could come in if he needed to. Obviously, he gets invited in by the mom, right? And so for me, that was terrifying. And then they throw in that these not just vampires running around, that Ed, crazy evil Ed, turns into like straight werewolf almost, like, and he has that wolf transformation at one point that I almost fell over. I was like, oh my God, this movie's bananas. So the movie definitely hit me hard. It was one of those that like I didn't sleep for a couple nights. I did keep checking my neighbor's backyard constantly with binoculars, like what's he carrying? What's he doing? Like he probably thought I was a creep. But yeah, I was definitely watching Steven. That fool. I was just like, all right, you're not going anywhere without me seeing you. And so Fright Night, it scarred me in the sense that I was watching my neighbor way too much.
Wow.
Steven, when I saw this movie, so I think we're about the same age. I was born in 81.
Yeah, I was 81 too.
I saw this probably when I was about 8 or 9 as well. And I, too, became firmly convinced that a lady that was like catty corner to us across the street was a witch. To the point that I had convinced one of my friends, to go over, and the way we lived in Alaska and everyone was like had a fenced in yard. My friend lived next door to her. And so we went into his yard and they had these big, I don't know, like power generator things, like those big things that they have out there with the little do not climb on this. We climbed on it to get over the fence into her backyard. And we had for weeks, I had planned, like I had looked at her house. I had figured out when she was gone. I thought she was gone, and we jumped into her backyard because I was like, we're going to look and we're going to see a cauldron in her kitchen. We jumped into the backyard, and what do we see? Her standing there, just staring at us.
Just looking. Oh, my God.
And there was no power box on this side to get, like, back over and jump into the yard. So like, we screamed, and we took off running in through the gate and opened the gate, and I went running into my house and hid under my bed. Under my bed. Not under my blankets, under my bed.
That is hilarious. See, I mean, that's what I'm saying. That's what this kind of a movie can do to you when you watch it that young, especially, you get all of these. I mean, in the 80s, it's like anything could be possible anyway. We were watching movies about time travel. We were watching Star Wars. I mean, at this point, the world could be all of these things, right? And so, like, it was just such a movies still at this point also were just a big mystery, I think. Like, the magic of it was such a thing, right?
Yes.
And so it could be real, is the point. And so I think that's what Fright Night does so brilliantly is makes it feel like this is everyday suburbia that could happen to you.
God, Terry, that's so fucking funny. You had your own horror movie happen. You were truly...
How long did you stay under your bed? That's the question. Like, how long did you stay under your bed?
That I do not remember, but I was but I do know that she came over and talked to my parents.
Oh, wow.
I got in so much trouble.
I remember my parents had to talk to my friend about me watching it because, so my parents were semi-religious. And they knew from a very early age that I was just not. I wasn't into it. But when they went into my room and I had all these crucifixes in my room, they're just like, what's going on? And I've got all of these things like hanging everywhere. And they're like, something's the problem. And I was like, I won't say his name, Jimmy down the street. But like, so showed me Fright Night and there's something going on with the neighbor. My mom's like, oh my God.
Wait, like, you hung crucifixes in your room?
Yeah, I had them hanging up by little strings. Like I was worried.
Okay. So did I.
I was worried. I thought at any moment, if I could have, I would have figured out how to sharpen some stakes. But like, I just couldn't figure that part of it out.
I did that too.
See, you were farther along than me. Like I was way behind in my prep, so I only had things. So yeah, he definitely after that he was like, I'm not showing you anything else, and that was a big lie because he showed me all kinds of things. But like, yeah, that movie was something for me that was one of the movies that I look back on and think, yeah, it shaped me in a sense of being scared. But I just also love the visual style of the movie, the palette of the movie, the way it was shot. It's such a great movie.
I mean, talk about practical effects. Like,
Yeah.
even, like, I mean, I know that's going, like, way forward in the movie, but the vampires in this, I love the contrast between, like, beautiful, sexy Sarandon coming in and, like, seducing your mom and your girlfriend, and then, like,
And you.
and me, duh. And then, like, immediately turns nasty. And I love this, like, the contrast between, like, a sexy person and a grotesque vampire, because so often it's like a sexy vampire or a gross vampire, but this gets to do both in a really cool way that I also think a lot of movies don't do necessarily now. Like, it's usually one or the other, and to have this so committed to being like swoon, scary, weird face, I love that about this movie and what it's doing with that.
Yeah, there's some really great moments like that. I mean, when Jerry at first feels like he's a sex machine, right? And he can seduce any woman on the block, right? And then you go and you get to him for the first time, and the first time he vampires out, you're like, oh shit, he's like legit crazy looking vampire. Like, he is
scary.
Gnarly, you know,
this
like, and
Dracula.
so you just weren't expecting it. And again, because I think maybe Lost Boys didn't really they did have their faces change, but they didn't change as much as Jerry did in Fright Night.
It got like a little bit scrunchy, but it didn't like, they still looked like Kiefer Sutherland still looked kind of like Kiefer Sutherland, but in this one, he looks like, they don't look like their people form anymore. It's like it's a transformation without them changing into something that's not a human, if that makes sense.
And then to that point, they did have great transformation scenes in that movie.
It sure did.
You know, like, there's some really gross moments. I mean, it was like, especially when Ed was changing back from the wolf to a human after he gotten stabbed through the chest. I mean, there's a whole sequence of him, and it's just really gross and awesome. And so I think, you know, that's something for me that I took away. It was like, okay, one day I'm going to get to do that.
That's so cool. Well, Terry, this is one of your favorites, right? Though, like, this is a favorite of yours, right?
This is a cozy watch for me. This is something that I have before it was even available here in the States, because for a while it wasn't. I had this Umbrella. I think it was Umbrella or Eureka. That was a Region Zero. Because it's not available here in the States because of, weirdly enough, Menendez. I have the German of Fright Night Part 2.
That's awesome.
Because it's not readily available here because it's caught up in Wright's nightmare because of the death of Jose Menendez.
That's right. You can't even find it. You can't even find it. I don't even think it's streaming.
No, it's not. Yeah. Because apparently at some... So, like... Jose Menendez was apparently the head of New Century Vista. Right. And then when he was killed, this all got caught up in like rights issues that have never been solved. And so crazy. You can't get it here in the States.
That's good to hear that it's someone else's favorite movie, because it was definitely one of mine. It's been I mean, it's funny because I had just watched this like last week, and when they were like, hey, you want to talk about what your favorite movie would movie to bring on here? And I was like, well, it's got to be. I just watched it. And so Fright Night was an easy choice. And it's like you said, it's a cozy watch because I probably watch it once a year at least. And so it's also something I can't wait to show my kids. I'm like seething. I'm like, oh, can I do it yet? And so, but it is definitely a movie for me that hits all the feels.
Yeah. So when this movie kind of blew my mind initially, just because I grew up, my dad loved the Universal monster movies. And so I kind of grew up with monsters that were away from you, you know, whether it was in Transylvania or in London or wherever. They were not here in the States. They were not here in my backyard. And so like it was sort of, while the movies terrified him when he was growing up, for me, it was this kind of comfort thing where it's like, I want to go to a place like Transylvania where it's kind of creepy and spooky and Gothic architecture, or go to Victorian London. Like that was separate. And so it was this movie, because Dracula was my favorite. Vampires, when I was a kid, were my favorite creature, and I'd only ever seen vampires in London or Transylvania or somewhere not here, somewhere decades, hundreds of years behind us. And so seeing this movie, and you kind of mentioned this a little earlier too, Stephen, where it's like, no, the vampire is in suburbia. This was like a mind-blowing thing for me as a kid that was raised on those types of films. And I just remember being like, oh my God, vampires can live today? And I think that is what kind of stuck in the back of my mind, that maybe what else could live today, hence my neighbor across the street was a witch. But This movie, I remember you kind of this is what kind of triggered this idea, because you said you're champing at the bit sort of to like introduce your kids to it. I think my dad probably introduced this to me a little too young, because this sort of informed my parents' rule about R-rated movies, where I could not see nudity.
Right.
And so there is a couple scenes in here where it just immediately makes me feel like I'm watching something dirty, because I used to watch this movie all the time, but I was very good at closing my eyes. And so anytime, like the first shot we see of Jerry and the woman, and she is naked and she is in the window, and the music is a little porny. It's that kind of porn, like seductive music in the background. Every time I hear that, I just think I'm brought back to me as a kid doing this, because in my mind, if my parents found out that I was not closing my eyes at those parts, they would stop me from being able to watch these movies. And so I was very dutiful about self-censoring the parts that I couldn't see.
See, that's what's crazy too. It's like, I do remember that also with my parents. They were the same way. They were like, yo, you got to close your eyes. It's like that. So it is interesting that you say that. And like, when will my kids be old enough to watch that? Because I was watching it thinking, man, this whole score is kind of porny. Like the score for Fright Night in general has this very seductive element to it, and I'm sure that's on purpose. Obviously, I feel like that's part of the lure of the vampire, is to be seductive. And Tom Holland, who directed the movie, is master at work in this movie. By the way, like, he just knows where to put the camera.
Movie,
but I think
this was his first movie.
This might be Tom's. I can't remember. Maybe it
was. I
was.
believe it is his first. It's his directorial debut. What a
it might have
fucking
been his first
debut,
studio
brother!
movie.
Like, that's great. Like, when I look back on movies like this in this podcast, I'm like, I'm sorry, that was your first movie?
I know.
Fuck you.
That is fucking wild when you think about it, and the way it was, and the look. I mean, obviously, you got to shoot it on the lot, which is fucking beautiful anyway. But like, it just has a certain vibe to it that is a throwback to those movies that you and your dad watched, right? Where it has that kind of look to it. But it brings the monster home, which is what you were talking about, which is sort of a really awesome way to modernize it, right? It's sort of a gateway for people that remember old school movies, but it is a gateway on another level for our age group who are modern and want to see something at home. And so that's what the beauty of the movie is sort of blending those two generations into a fusion, right? And so it's something that I think ultimately, like, I will be to really enjoy with my son. Like, we're gonna have a blast watching this movie at some point, because I think it sort of brings those things together. But it, also it's just on another level of scary. It does a great job of building tension. It does a great job of storytelling. And it's all clean, right? Like, clean story. There's nothing excessed about it as far as like subplots that you don't need to know about. It gets to the point right off the bat. Right at the beginning of the movie, we're already seeing him dragging in a dead body. Like, when does that happen in the 80s? Like, in the 80s and 90s, movies drug on to get to anything, right? And so for that to happen right after he's just tried to, get it on with his girlfriend, and she's like, nope, I'm out. He sees, or was it in the middle of it? I can't remember. It might have been in the middle of it that he sees him pulling out the dead body, and that's why she leaves, right? So it's just one of those things that this movie kind of was a pioneer, if you think about it, when it was doing something right off the bat. Like, now movies have to do that, right? Now we have to do something right away to get everybody's attention.
Yeah.
Well, you said the kind of blending of generations, and that just blew my mind, because my dad, he did not like modern horror for the most part. He, grew up on the Universal, the 1950s, that type of stuff, Hammer films. And I think that was sort of where his interest stopped. And so I think this was sort of like the kind of passing of the torch, where I would watch it because he loved this movie. And so I would watch it with him. And I think because of Peter Vincent in particular, where it brought back in mind him watching the Friday night monster movies, or hearing all that kind of stuff. So I think this might have been the stop of him. This is where I'm exiting the horror genre. And then it sort of introduced me to a modern day setting of horror, where it wasn't ancient castles or hundreds of years ago, or whatever the case may be. So it for me too, I'm just now realizing that this was sort of the breaking point for me and my dad in terms of our interests. And I went forward with all of the 80s, all of the 90s, all the excess. But my dad was
it's because they shot it on the lot. And that is what gives the movie that old school vibe. And even the homes are a little bit more tower structured, like they would have been in the old school monster movies, but they're not towers or castles, they're homes, but they have that vibe. Like there could have been old school towers if you really did, if you wanted them to be. And I think that's a testament to their production design and trying to weave that modern Transylvania on the block vibe. And I think all those things do such a great job of sort of tricking you into feeling like you're watching an older movie, but you're watching a modern movie. So I think you're spot on with the idea that is probably where that's probably why your dad loves the movie, because he can't figure out, why do I like a modern movie like this? Well, it's because they're tricking you. They're telling you and making it feel like you're watching something you used to watch, but not really. And I think that's a cool thing.
It's interesting you're talking about that too, because everyone's going to laugh at me, but I was born in 93. I am a little bit younger. I did not see this first. I saw the 2011 Fright Night first.
Right.
And I was like, okay, it's fine. Like, everyone's hot in it. But, like, because I saw it because I had a crush on Colin Farrell. But I was like, it didn't, like, stick with me as much. But then I was like, okay, I have to see the original now. And what the new one is missing on top of a lot of other things, I think, are two things. One, it doesn't have that lot feel. Yeah. It feels very, like, not like a real place, but not in a good way. And two, I think the connection between Charlie and Peter Vincent's character is really important in terms of, like, Peter Vincent being old school, and there's like this generational thing, but then David Tennant's character, we don't have that, it's not that same vibe of like a generational gap being bridged. He's more just like a Chris Angel knockoff that I feel like didn't really necessarily land as well with the relationship. So it's just interesting, like, picking space from when I first saw it and listening to you guys talk about it. It really makes sense to me. I haven't rewatched the 2011 one in a long time. Not to, like, I remember liking it, but
I like the 2011.
So hard.
I like it, but I think you're right in the sense that it's hard to do the same thing with the generational gap between, you know, a character on TV who he's got to go higher, and then in the newer one being, like, you're right, a Chris Angel ripoff. That's just really difficult to pull off in the modern era because kids don't watch TV the same way that we used to watch TV, where the reruns or old school things playing. Like, everybody on TV is their age. So, like, they curate TV to kids now, right? Like, TV didn't used to be curated to kids. TV was curated to adults. And so adults were the ones watching at night, and that's what they were getting, right? And so once TV start curating to kids, then it changes. And so it's really difficult for the 2011 version to sort of find that pairing. I mean, you know, I don't know how else they could have done it, but it's not a bad movie. It just doesn't hit the same way because, you know, it's just what it is.
Exactly.
But it's definitely an interesting interpretation. I think the last time I watched it was a few years ago, and I remember thinking, okay, this is better than what I thought it was, to be honest with you. When I watched it again, I was like, okay, I like this more than I did the first time I saw it. But I definitely, going back and watching the original, I was like, God, this movie just does so many things right that it's almost like why you go, please don't mess with these.
No, exactly. Because again, like, and especially because this movie is operating on so many interesting levels also about, like, queerness. Yeah. That's not like at the forefront, but, you know, we have Jerry and his assistant, and like all of the kind of hinting about that, and like, oh, this, like, you know, oh, the two men who live together next door. And then there's also Evil Ed's character who is seduced by Jerry, right? Am I, like, my mind just
he is in an alleyway, right? Like, it's
it's very interesting how this film, and like, especially in this time period, we're square in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and Terry, you and I have talked about this, how this movie is doing some really interesting things and talking about queer identity without, like, fully talking about it. But, like, if you know, you kind of see what's going on here, especially with Evil Ed's character, which I find so cool for an 80s film that is, like, mainstream and having those conversations in a time where it was so taboo to talk about queerness.
Totally. That's why it's brilliant. That's why it's brilliant, is because, you know, Tom is doing that in an era where it's like people were trying to stay away from maybe that. And so I think him bringing that sort of awareness to a movie like this is fucking awesome. And I think it was just pretty much opened the door for other movies to say, okay, we can explore this kind of thing. And I think that, to me, is exciting about 80s movies in general, is because I think 80s movies and 80s horror specifically were always sort of pushing the boundaries of what people were expecting or what culture was at that time. They were sort of pushing the boundary of what culture could be, and what the country could be. And like, I think that is what's really great about horror in general for me. And what I love about it is that the community embraces, you know, the weird, the crazy, the not so normal. Like, I think that's what I love about it. And I love that it's always on the forefront of pushing issues. I think for me, that's always interesting.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, as a kid, the scene that bothered me the most as a child, and I never really knew why, was Evil Ed's death. And it wasn't until like watching it now as like an adult, openly gay man trying to like re-look at the films that I loved as a kid. And that scene is like, it's the heaviest moment of the movie. It's not like the spectacle violence. It is this kid who is now, he has been stabbed, he is dying, and he is slowly reverting back to this naked boy who is reaching out for help, and Peter Vincent shies away from him. And it's this like, as an adult, like looking into like the subtext behind that, because both of those men were gay. Roddy McDowell was not openly gay until after his death, when friends would say, yeah, he was gay. And then we have the guy that plays Evil Ed. I'm drawing a blank on his
Stephen Jeffries.
Stephen Jeffries, who played Evil Ed, who would come out in the 90s, and he was doing gay porn in the 90s. But like,
was he really? I didn't realize he was doing gay porn in the 90s.
Yeah. Huh. So we have like this at a time in the 80s when the AIDS crisis is about ready to start. We have this young gay man who is reaching out, unbeknownst to this older gay man who is turning away from him. And so like, as an adult, I find that scene so upsetting in a different way than with the subtext behind it than when I did as a kid. But that scene was always to me like the one that, oh, this is something more than just biting necks and sexy vampires and assistants turning into pea soup or woman with giant shark maw in her mouth. Right. Like, this is like more than that. And that, I don't know, it just, that scene always just bothered me.
I mean, that's heavy, right? And I think when you actually watch the transformation, and I did like last week when I watched it again, I mean, it's slow, it's painful. It doesn't shy away from showing you the pain. And there's something about that, like you're saying, for me, that's something I hadn't thought about. And then thinking about it now, it's kind of obvious, and just staring at you in the face. And especially because it is Peter Vincent in the room and it's not Charlie, it's not Brewster. It's Peter Vincent, who's the one that's sort of backing away and not really knowing what to do with this kid that is literally changing and dying in front of him. There's something really heavy about that. And so, that's a really good observation.
I just like, it's some of this is really funny to me as an adult now, just because like, it seems, if I'm looking at it through a queer lens, it seems so like obvious because you mentioned the very start of the movie where Brewster and his girlfriend are making out. He wants to go further. She's unsure. She's like, okay, finally, let's go have sex. And the moment they're about to, there's two men coming in next door carrying a body, and he's like more obsessed with that than the one thing that he seems to be. So I kind of see him as sort of like this chaotic bisexual, and this is like his coming his coming out of the closet moment. Because
I don't think that's a bad take at all. I think that's an interesting take because I mean, if you throw in Ed, who's constantly badgering him, right, and you kind of can feel that tension a little bit with the both of them, with Charlie and Ed. And the fact that she's coming between whatever friendship they have, which seems like it seems very like a turmoil friendship anyway. Like, you can't tell if they like each other or hate each other because he's calling him Evil Ed half the time. I think that take is pretty great because he really never gets where he wants. Charlie never gets where he wants to go anyway. He's got to save her eventually, but it's not like he's getting there sexually, right? Like with her,
right?
And so it's a very interesting take on that whole material, because the movie definitely has so many different layers, and maybe that's what makes these movies so great, is the layers, right? And when you start peeling them back and finding out different things that you didn't see as a kid, which is very superficial, and then as you get older and you start realizing, wait a minute, maybe they were trying to push this or that or have different ideas. And I think that's what's great about horror movies, is that you can just take them and really peel them back.
My favorite line as an adult now, though, is when The vampire is able to get in his house. Jerry is able to come in, and he goes to Evil Ed, and Evil Ed is like, "Where do you expect the vampire to attack next?" And he says, "Tonight, my bedroom."
Yeah.
And then what happens? Jerry literally comes out of the closet in his room while he is standing there looking out the window.
So
it's like
good.
it makes me laugh. It's just
so good.
like it's just yeah. Oh, I love this movie.
Fright Night, queer classic, everyone. That's what I'm
It's a
going
great
to
movie.
say. It's a great
great
classic.
film.
It's a queer classic. It's just amazing. On that note, do we want to just wrap this up and give this our rating out of 5 since we're at about an hour?
Sounds good to me.
Cool.
All right. I think I know what we're all going to give this, but Terry, you're up first. How many You're So Cool Brewsters out of 5 do you give Fright Night?
I kind of tip my hat. This is a classic for me. This is a comfort watch. This is one that I am constantly watching as an adult now. And so this is a 5 You're So Cool Brewsters out of 5. What about you, Mary Beth?
I give this 5 out of 5. I talked about how much of a queer classic it is, but not just that. It's just the most beautiful, creepy, sexy vampire movie that I think got me into really loving vampires. I think it really showed me what I like why I love movies like 30 Days of Night with these like really attractive vampires and also really scary ones. And I just think this is always going to be like a Hallmark classic for me in terms of vampire movies. So it's got to be a 5. Stephen, you have the final word. How many You're So Cool Brewsters out of 5 do you give?
I mean,
Fright
this is
Night?
a 6, right? Like this is so cool, Brewster to the max. If I could give it more, I would. But you're 100% right. It's a classic. It does everything right. It takes you on a ride. It gives you a great story. It gives you some great sexual moments. It has a lot of potential to be scary and fun at the same time. So for me, this is the ultimate classic vampire flick.
Heck yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us to talk about Fright Night. Where can are you online? Where can the listeners find you? And the floor is yours to plug away with everything you can talk about.
So you can find me at Instagram or Twitter, X, whatever. It's at Stephen C. Miller. And please, on December 6th, go out, see Werewolves in the theater. It's playing everywhere. So I really encourage you guys to get out, see it, tell your friends to see it, and just, wolf out, have some fun.
Hell yeah.
All right, listeners, you've heard from us, but we want to hear from you. You can email us at scarredforlifepodcast@gmail.com, or you can let us know on social media. I am at MB McAndrews on Twitter and at MB.McAndrews on Instagram.
And I'm at Gaily Dreadful everywhere.
And don't forget to follow the podcast on social media. We are at Scarred Podcast on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Scarred for Life Podcast on Instagram.
And please don't forget to review, rate, and subscribe. And if you want to help support us, we do have a Patreon.
Thank you to Eric Power for our artwork. Thank you to Sean Keller for our music. Thank you everyone for listening. Please stay safe out there, but most importantly, stay creepy.
And until next time.